Hi, welcome to a live edition of True North Update. I'm your host, Candice Malcolm, joined by True North fellow Andrew Lawton. Andrew, how's it going? Thank you so much for joining me today.
It is another Friday in the final few weeks of summer, so I can't complain too much.
Yeah, I guess summer's officially over now. We're into Labor Day long weekend, which came a little late this year, but given the fact that we've kind of been at a standstill for the past 6 months, it's like, finally we're going to get back to something. I don't know if schools are going back or, we're going to have Parliament back in September, but, it's just kind of just been like one long, slow news cycle for the last 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. So much so that I don't really know when the point was where we flipped to kind of normalcy, if we're even there yet. So I think we're in somewhat of a weird hybridy hodgepodge of it. And who knows? I know we'll be talking later on about the possibility of a fall election. So maybe we should be careful what we wish for in that sense of trying to get out of the indefinite vacation or indefinite slump or indefinite news cycle, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, exactly. We might be catapulted into busy weeks where we're working nonstop, but I would be okay. Well, Andrew, there's a lot to get through in the show today, just because it seems like there's a lot of things going towards hinting towards what's to come with Justin Trudeau and his big throne speech that's happening later in September. There's been a lot of sort of leaked stories and experts promoting different theories and all this kind of stuff. So let's get to it all because it's really, really interesting. So before we get to this sort of speculation about what's to come in that throne speech, let's go through the job numbers. We learned that according to StatsCan, unemployment has dipped. So the Canadian economy added about 250,000 jobs in August, which was sort of a slower pace given that we added 400,000 jobs in July. Looks like unemployment rate fell to 10% in August, down from 11% in July. At the height of COVID, the unemployment rate was almost 14%, 13.7. And then if we go back before that, so pre-COVID in February, the unemployment rate was all the way down at 5.6, I think it was. So, our unemployment rate is still double what it had been, but it looks like things are slowly but surely getting back to normal. And I wanted to note this came from a Globe and Mail story. It was sort of buried in, but you think about what happened in Canada with the Canadian economy throughout the COVID, right? We had the COVID pandemic. We're told that we had to shut down the economy. Trudeau shut down the economy and said, hey, look, because we're forcing you to lose your livelihood, essentially forcing you to shut down your business, shut down your store, not go to work, we'll compensate you with CERB, with other kind of benefits. Well, it turns out that in that quarter, so the Canadian households lost a combined $21 billion in employment compensation. And in the same quarter, they received $54 billion in government transfers. So Trudeau's compensation for making people not go to work and shutting down the economy was almost 3 times what Canadians lost in income, which is just absolutely staggering number and sort of a recipe for fiscal disaster. I mean, I can't believe this isn't a bigger story, Andrew. When you just think about those numbers, we lost $21 billion in work money that we would have earned, and that the government spent $54 billion transferred back to individual Canadians. So, it makes it seem like it's, no problem in Canada. It's better to be unemployed and getting almost 3 times as much as what you would have earned if you were out there working hard. What did you think about that?
Yeah, and one thing that I'd be really interested in seeing, and I don't even know if it's possible to break down the numbers in this way, is see the imbalance of who was getting that 50 some odd billion dollars. And the reason I say that is because I've heard continuously since the very beginning of the federal government's relief program rollout that a lot of employers and businesses were just completely losing hand over fist, not able to apply or not able to be eligible for some of the programs. And even the ones that they were only really giving a Band-Aid, if that, on what they were dealing with. And conversely, we've all heard stories of people that were never working that started getting CERB, or people that were getting CERB while also taking in money, or people who were getting CERB and not really quite clear on whether they were actually eligible, but they were doing it anyway. And remember, at the height of things, we heard that 8 million people had applied, and we don't know how many of those reapplied and got it for multiple months. But even in one single month that had 8 million CERB recipients, that would work out to be about $16 billion. So that right there is about a third of this total amount that we're talking about here. And a lot of it that my concern really rests on is that of that money that outpaces how much people lost in employment compensation, I don't think much of it actually went to employers who were shouldering the burden of a lot of the costs due to the shutdowns.
Right. I mean, some of it was there, like deferred mortgages and that kind of thing, but that's still presumably the debt that belongs to the business owner. It's not free cash from the government. So that's a really good point. And, with any government scheme, it's going to benefit some people a lot more than others. So I think you're right in imagining that, some people were much, much better off given COVID and the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, or CERB, whereas other people obviously, lost their business, lost their livelihood, had to go bankrupt, lost their homes, lost everything. So it's not equally distributed, but it does sort of give you an indicator of, Trudeau came to the Canadian public and said, we're going to shut down the economy, but don't worry, we're going to give you these emergency relief payments. But instead of just covering the lost income, the Trudeau government went on like, a spending bonanza and just racked up record debt. I think our current deficit is approaching $400 billion at this point, and so much more is to come. Every pet project that any Liberal could ever dream of is now either in the works or being, written up as we speak for the throne speech. So I think what we're seeing is just an incredible case study, Andrew, in a government acting without any restraints whatsoever, and just basically spending any money that it can think of, which kind of makes you think that they're gearing towards an election. The more that I see Trudeau and all of these spending proposals and promises, it really feels like we are heading towards an election, and Trudeau's doing the thing that politicians love to do, which is bribing the public with their own money. So John Ivison, a columnist over at the National Post, had a story really interesting. The headline was, Trudeau's literally frightening spending plan has some Liberals and bureaucrats very worried. If you have Liberals and bureaucrats worried about federal spending, then I think you're going above and beyond, even for Justin Trudeau. But basically, just a bunch of quotes from civil servants and Liberal insiders saying that whatever the Liberals do have planned, it's something that is extraordinary. That they're embarking on a major policy shift. That they're not at all worried about deficits, that there's going to be structural changes in the way that government operates. Basically sounds like they're going to unleash some kind of a utopian socialist plan, Andrew, where we remake our entire economy, snap our fingers and turn it green, and built with pixie dust and rainbows. But the more I read about it, and there were several leaks, not just John Ivison. We saw something like this in a Bloomberg article talking about how Chrystia Freeland has been tapped to basically reimagine the Canadian economy and redesign all these fiscal programs. It feels like something big is coming down the pike. And I don't know, judging from these leaks, it sounds pretty terrifying. Like Trudeau, he was pretending to at least be modest all this way, and now suddenly, we're getting the full socialist. No more Liberals, taking it slow. We're going full speed ahead down that fiscal ruinous path towards socialism. What do you make of all this?
If so, it would really explain why that relationship between Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau got as fractured as it did, to such a point that Morneau left to take on an international role with the OECD. And listen, I mean, the nature of politics is that we'll know when we know. I do think that Justin Trudeau has typically been hampered by some of the more centrist traditions in the Liberal Party. And if you go back to 2015, it seems like gradually those people are being pushed further and further out. And I mean, again, this is not calling, people in the Liberals conservatives by any stretch, but you had people that were not socialists that were in there, people like John McCallum, Stéphane Dion, Bill Morneau, and more of these people are finding themselves on the outskirts, and it's the Freelands, the McKennas, the Trudeaus that are occupying a larger and larger share of the Liberal caucus and of the Liberal brand. So I wouldn't be surprised with it. Remember, the Liberals were uninterested in reining in the deficit when the economy was good because they said we could afford to spend. When the economy's bad, they say, well, now we need deficits because we need to spend to keep us out of ruin in families. Trudeau has been very indignant when asked about debt by saying, well, I mean, the government can borrow cheaply, so it's really no issue, even though a low interest rate is still interest. And we're talking about billions and billions that are going to be spent on servicing this debt with no end in sight whatsoever for getting rid of the deficit, let alone chipping away at the debt. So there are big problems here, and these things are not theoretical issues. But the problem is that the Trudeau government has always focused more on trying to sell what it's buying without having to worry about how they're actually paying for it or how they're pretending to pay for it.
Right, and in that regard, I mean, the fact that, so right now, as it currently stands, I mean, Canada's debt is higher than it's ever been. It's double what it was a decade ago, and Trudeau seems to be dead set on doubling it again. We pay about 9% of the total revenue to government towards servicing the debt, and that's an environment with low interest rates and before Trudeau adds his next spending bonanza. So you can only imagine what would happen if, the economy shifts and we get plunged into a further recession, if interest rates do go up. I mean, then you're talking about a much bigger percentage of the federal revenue going towards servicing the debt, which, again, is just a waste of money. It's like money going to bankers and to Bay Street instead of going towards social services for Canadians. So you're going to end up with higher taxes or reduced spending or some kind of a combination. It's like, we've already been here. We lived through this. This happened in the 90s. Trudeau Sr. introduced massive new spending programs that were never reined in. The 70s and 80s were just completely categorized by growth and spending with the slumpish economy. And then by the 90s, Canada was almost bankrupt. And that the sort of lesson that everyone learned in all the parties was, okay, we need to have a modicum of fiscal responsibility. And Trudeau is just completely throwing that out the door. And the way that they're speaking, the leaks that we're seeing in the media, and the way that Trudeau himself is talking, it seems like this is just the beginning, Andrew, because they have something even more ambitious to come. So here is a clip of Justin Trudeau alluding to just that, and just note at the end of the clip, it's a 2-minute clip. So, he talks about why he's doing this, what he thinks that Canadians want, how he wants to rebuild the economy and make it more equitable, more green, yada, yada, yada. But then he specifically says that he doesn't have a democratic mandate to do this, which I find very interesting. Let's play that clip.
Prime Minister, you've been having virtual meetings today with business leaders in BC about the green recovery. What specifics were discussed in these meetings, and how will this green recovery help businesses recover from the COVID crisis?
Well, I think one of the things, when we talk about a green recovery, what we're actually talking about is a long-term recovery for our economy. We know the world is going towards greater energy efficiency. We know the world is going towards lower carbon. We know the world is moving towards more renewable energy. This is the way the world is going. We need to make sure that we're leading the way, that we're part of that in a way that reassures people in existing industries, people who have jobs now or are worried about their jobs because of COVID or have lost their jobs because of COVID, that our plan for the future of the economy includes them. So yes, there's an awful lot we can and must be doing around improving our economy in many different ways, including in real steps towards fighting this other crisis that we're facing on top of COVID and the opioid crisis, which is the climate change crisis. As we move forward in reimagining what the Canadian economy can look like in the coming years, we have an opportunity to go greener. We have an opportunity to be fairer, to reduce barriers for women's participation, for Indigenous participation in the workforce. There are so many things that we can look at as an opportunity through this tragedy of COVID to do bigger things. But that's why we're putting together a throne speech now that will set out this ambitious agenda before Parliament, and parliamentarians can decide, because we're in a minority situation, whether this government has the support to move forward on this new agenda that, quite frankly, nobody ran an election on a year ago because we didn't know about COVID. This was a completely different situation, and laying that out, which includes an ambitious green agenda, is going to be what we're doing at the end of this month.
So, Andrew, Trudeau, by his very own admission there, says that he doesn't have the mandate to do this kind of thing, that what he ran for and the world that we lived in and the election that he won in 2019 is not at all what he's proposing now. So wouldn't that mean that he should call an election just out of the very principle of it? I mean, all those things that he wants to do, all those things he wants to accomplish, he hasn't really put that to Canadians, and having parliamentarians vote on it is flawed because each party has its own sort of vested interests. I think that what Trudeau is saying really leads Canadians to the conclusion that we should have an election to decide whether or not we actually want to go forth with this truly reckless plan.
Yeah, and I think that there is a bigger ideological problem that is, I think, underpinning this, because I agree wholeheartedly with you that if you're going to do anything bold or anything that is a departure from what you campaigned on in the previous election, you have to seek another mandate if you want it to be a legitimate course of action. And I don't mean legally legitimate, but I mean morally legitimate in this particular case. But the problem is that the global elites right now are hell-bent on actually leveraging coronavirus to ram a lot of really radical things that they've wanted to put in place for years down the throats of unwitting populations. I mean, just as one example here, if you look at the Davos Forum, the World Economic Summit, the theme this year, the title of their big virtual summit is The Great Reset. And the description is an opportunity and an urgent need, to use their words, an urgent need for global stakeholders to cooperate in simultaneously managing the direct consequences of the crisis to improve the state of the world. They're launching the Great Reset Initiative. And the number of stories that we saw, even in March, when we didn't quite know the full scope of the pandemic. I'll just rhyme off a few headlines here. LA Times, coronavirus offers opportunity on climate change. Al Jazeera, coronavirus crisis offers big green opportunity. Time Magazine, what coronavirus means for the possibility of a carbon-free economy. It doesn't matter how many people's lives have been destroyed, careers have been destroyed, how many businesses have had to shut down. The fact that there has been a big shock to the world and to the economy has given these people, to them, license to ram a lot of things that would, under any other circumstances, be seen as radical. And they want to rebuild the economy in their image, not what it was before we went down this road in the first place. And that's a huge danger.
That's a really important observation you made, Andrew, because this is what they've been advocating for a decade. This isn't anything new. And so now is just the opportunity. It kind of echoes what Chrystia Freeland, the new finance minister, said in her sort of inaugural press conference there. She said that Corona presented a fabulous opportunity, which, you don't really usually think of a huge global pandemic and resulting recession that has destroyed, trillions of dollars from the economy as a fabulous opportunity. It's just
I learned in my first year of university about the broken window fallacy, and now Canada's finance minister doesn't seem to be familiar with the concept.
Right, and just even the language that you would use, it seems a little tone deaf to describe what we're going through right now as something fabulous. Further your point, there was a CTV headline that was just, for anyone who watches my podcast knows, this is like my biggest pet peeve when a news headline does something like this. But CTV reported over there, they said the feds should invest $50 billion in green projects for post-pandemic stimulus. Experts. So CTV has gone out and found a bunch of left-wing activists and people who, basically hate fossil fuels and want to pull Canada's resource economy out and build something totally different. And we're told that that's what the experts believe in, that we should just, now's the time, guys, let's invest another $50 billion. What's $50 billion when the government's already borrowing, over $1 trillion and plunging the country further and further into debt. So lots of that coming from voices on the left, lots of people saying that we should rebuild the economy this way. I think now is the time for more prudent voices, more people to be calling out this Trudeau government, and a really good opportunity, frankly, for Conservative leader Erin O'Toole to carve a different path, to outline a different economic recovery for Canada, one that's maybe perhaps more rooted in reality and based on the restraints of, how much money do we actually have to spend, and let's not completely plunge our entire society into endless debt. So Erin O'Toole has done a couple of interviews. He's kind of coming out strong, I would say, as new leader. But he did say that he would plan to erase the deficit in a decade. So it would take him 10 years to do it, which sort of signals and indicates to me that he's in no real rush, that he doesn't really have a plan to balance the budget. And in some ways, you can't blame him, just given the scope of how much Trudeau has how much debt has been created, how much new spending programs have been created. Conservatives often get the reputation of being sort of mean-spirited and cutting off programs. And so you can't just turn the taps off overnight, although Trudeau did just turn them on overnight. But, O'Toole's sort of coming across as trying to be very moderate, which is probably wise, given that Trudeau is taking such a giant step to the left. So, Andrew, what do you make of Aaron O'Toole's pledge? How do you think he's doing so far in his first few weeks as leader here?
Well, I think on the note of the deficit reduction, I think there's a cautionary tale here on how difficult it is to undo big spending, because ultimately people get entitled to their entitlements. And when you have deficits that are looking to be potentially as high as $300 billion and even beyond that, no reduction plan in sight, he can't just say we're going to cut that deficit down to a balanced budget within 4 years, as you could if it were a bit more of a modest deficit. And if you remember back in the federal election, the Conservatives under Andrew Scheer put something forward that I actually didn't like, which was a law that would compel governments to balance the budget, but it wouldn't go into effect until after 4 years. So the government would have basically been binding future governments to a fiscal plan that it wasn't prepared or didn't feel ready to enact had Andrew Scheer been elected. And I mean, we know that is kind of a moot discussion now, but you have to be able to start making very tough calls. And you can't get a 6 or 9 figure budget, I guess, down to a balanced without making some of those tough calls. And if Aaron O'Toole rather starts talking about doing anything too radical, we know what's going to happen. Everyone is going to be coming out of the woodwork saying you're going to cut this, cut that. I mean, we know that he has pledged to defund CBC, so there's over $1 billion a year in savings potentially, or whichever portion of the CBC's funding is gone. And I think there are other things as well that you could do to start bringing the books back into balance, but it's not going to be easy. And yeah, I mean, 10 years. To me, as a Canadian taxpayer, I look at this and I say that's just a horrifying reality, that this is basically the future of the country for the foreseeable future. We know that governments never do things on time and on budget. So if they're promising 10, it could end up being 15. And that's assuming nothing happening between now and then that causes us to have to reset that with even more spending.
Right. I think it was Milton Friedman, an economist, who said there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. Well, this was all presented to Canadians as a temporary measure to help us get through the lockdowns. And suddenly we went from a temporary measure to completely reimagining the economy, spending, again, trillions of dollars to meet every pet project that a Liberal can dream up. And it looks like we're going to be stuck with it for a really long time. Well, and you kind of made this observation before the show started that it feels like Trudeau is in campaign mode. He's doing all these sort of small town interviews, radio interviews. He's been doing lots of spending announcements. We learned that the public sector unions and CRA employees just got a 10% pay raise, plus a $2,600 non-taxable cash payment for the Phoenix debacle that happened. Trudeau pledged $2 billion to the provinces to help get back to school initiatives going. It seems like a lot of these spending announcements are kind of campaign announcements. And then, you also have Aaron O'Toole sort of posturing. So I just want to ask you, do you think we're heading for a fall election? I'm kind of the opinion that we should have one, just given that if Trudeau wants to make this tremendous change in policy, he should bring it to the people, and Canadians should give a democratic mandate on whether we want to become a green socialist economy or not. But what do you think? Do you think that that's where we're headed?
I've said it in the past, and I think it bears repeating here, that if you were to take the pandemic factor out of the equation, there is zero doubt in my mind that Justin Trudeau should go back to the polls and seek another mandate if he wants the changes that he's proposing. The only thing that I think is making people leery about an election is the factor in play about how do you do an election safely and how do you run campaigns safely with all the public health questions. And I think we'll get a little bit of a glimpse of that watching how things unfold in the United States over the next couple of months. But I do believe that if you take that out of the equation, an election looks a lot more imminent. So with that being said, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, he's going to be coming back with a throne speech, which by his own admission is going to be a reset of the government and its priorities. So that means that Justin Trudeau is already pledging to come with a new list of promises, a new mandate, a renewed mandate, and a renewed focus and priority set from what he had when he took office in November in his second term. So how do you do that without seeking a mandate for that from the voters and have a moral justification to lead? I don't think you can. I will say, though, on this, that I do think there's an aspect here that's a bit complicating in that no one wants to be the one to send Canadians to the polls. And partially for the public health reasons, partially because we had an election less than a year ago. But I don't think Justin Trudeau wants to ask the Governor General to call an election because then it looks like he's being opportunistic. Similarly, I don't think Aaron O'Toole wants to make one of his first acts as Conservative leader to be to aggressively pursue the downfall of the government, because then he'll look opportunistic. So I think that both of them want the other side to blink first, basically, and send Canadians back to the polls. And I don't know who is going to win that standoff.
Well, we know that if it's the Conservatives that are the ones that send Canadians to the polls, we can expect an entire election cycle full of headlines talking about how reckless and irresponsible it was because Canadians will be forced to.
And I think that the Conservatives are keenly aware of that, which is why they don't want to be the ones to do it.
Well, Andrew, speaking of public health concerns, I think Dr. Theresa Tam, the top health official of Canada, really outdid herself in embarrassing Canadians. I think this headline sort of made its way around the world, and for all the cringeworthy things that Dr. Tam has said, and all the times she's flip-flopped and said, don't wear a mask, wear a mask, temperature checks don't work, do temperature checks, etc. This one tops them all. So this week, Theresa Tam tells Canadians, and this is not a joke, that they should wear masks while having sex. So she said, like other activities during COVID that involve physical closeness, there are some things you can do to minimize the risk of getting infected and spreading the virus. Canadians can find ways to enjoy physical intimacy while safeguarding the progress we have made in containing COVID. So wearing a mask while you're having sex. Okay, that's
you know what, that might work for some people. That, like, you know, I'm not one to tell anyone that what they like is wrong. I do think that right now we are in back to school mode. A lot of people are going to be heading back into the classroom soon. And when, you know, sex ed and student health offices resume, I never thought the discussion would be, hey, you know, don't forget to have protection.
A different kind of protection, I guess. Well, this goes, I had forgotten about this, or actually when I first seen it, I didn't think it was real. But the British Columbia government had said, I guess this came out a couple of weeks ago, but they likewise had their own recommendations for safe sex during coronavirus, which was to try to use something called a glory hole, which for those not familiar, basically it's when you cut a hole into a wall. Seriously. So this is the kind of stuff that the Canadian government is recommending, having sex while using a mask or having sex through a wall with something called a glory hole. So
I wasn't sure how much of the description you were going to go there. So I was like preemptively laughing on your behalf. I don't know if like you need to use the mask if you use a glory hole or if it's an either or.
Right.
That part has not been made clear from the public health guidance. I did not know that glory hole was a government word, like, you know, because typically governments have a way of making everything sound overly technical. So I guess there's no real way to describe that apart from just using the Urban Dictionary term. Right.
Which, again, when I saw this on Twitter, and I thought someone was just making it up, because I didn't believe that the government would actually go to that extent to making these kind of recommendations. But, you know, the whole concept of the nanny state and having, you know, governments in the bedrooms of Canadians, I think are taking on a whole new level. You know, Pierre Trudeau would be rolling in his grave because so it was pretty much the opposite of what he wanted. But under his son, Justin Trudeau, the government now has no problem barging right into the bedrooms of the nation.
Yeah, he had fought tooth and nail for, you know, to keep the state out of the glory holes of the nation. And here we are.
All right. This happened since the last show, so we should talk about it, even though it was last weekend now. But you know, this footage of a mob basically tearing down a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald in Montreal, it really irked a lot of Canadians. It got myself really worked up, really upset to see this kind of thing, the actions of the mob, but not just that, seeing these people tear down a statue of the person who literally Canada wouldn't exist as a country if it weren't for the efforts of John A. Macdonald. Obviously, he lived in a different time. Obviously, values and norms have changed over the last 150 years. But to try to completely erase our history or to go down this path of revisionism to say that, somehow Sir John A. Macdonald, oversaw a genocide and was this evil, maniacal leader, just simply not true. And seeing that statue crash to the ground and the head pop off and all of the sort of angry mob cheering, it was just really distressing to see, to say the least. Sort of trying to politicize it, and then seeing people on social media justifying it and cheering it and saying that it was inevitable, that it had to happen, was just pretty unsettling. I was actually happy to see Justin Trudeau come out and say that he was disappointed and say that that's not the right way to go about criticizing our history and trying to understand how to make society better. Although he did, according to the Globe and Mail, sink a little bit when he said in French, sort of blamed it on the extreme right. He said that I think we're seeing, particularly on the extreme right, that they're trying to start culture wars and divide Canadians on issues like this. I don't know how you can blame a far left mob tearing down a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald and then flip it to say, well, it's the far right that's creating these culture wars. That's just not what's happening. And, it takes quite the logical leap to see a left-wing mob destroying public property and then flipping that to blame the extreme right. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, it's that concept you had brought up, I think, on a couple of shows back that I hadn't heard of before you said it, Republicans pounce, where the media focuses more on the reaction to an act than on the act itself. And I think that was what Trudeau did. And I'm always leery whenever you see the Prime Minister, who does it quite a bit, saying something different in English than he does in French. It's like he's very much calculating his audience, and he knows in Quebec he can get away with saying one thing, and to the broader Canadian population he might not be able to or might not want to. Listen, I've got to say, I was angered by this as well, but I was really moved to see, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but to see your husband speak out about this, because he is himself an immigrant to Canada, and he has a greater appreciation and respect for Canada's founding than so many of these, thuggish mobbers that were taking down the statue and continue to. And I think there's a real lesson in that to people, that, the people that are claiming to be spoken up for by the mob actually aren't, and actually believe the opposite of what it is that the mob seeks.
Yeah, and interestingly, after Kaz, my husband, he posted a lot of things on social media about Sir John A. and the statue. I myself got a lot of messages from people, including a lot of immigrants to Canada, thanking him and thanking me for standing up for Canadian traditions and values and history, saying, look, we moved to Canada because of these institutions that you have, because of your history. And it's so disheartening to see this sort of mob mentality of people trying to destroy it. Look, it's one thing to look at our own history critically, try to improve as a country, try to say we should do better, acknowledge past injustices. That's totally different than saying, we must erase our history. Canada is illegitimate. Canada is a racist society built on racist principles. I think that really the left is jumping the shark when they try to do that. They lose so many people in the middle, and so many people who otherwise might be open to their message. People on the left are supposed to be standing up for disenfranchised people and people who are marginalized. Well, in this case, I think that they're alienating a lot of those people and not doing a service to anyone. So if there's any good that's come out of that, hopefully, Andrew, it's that more and more Canadians are united against the sort of mob mentality that's saying, like, hey, something interesting is happening in the U.S. Let's create our own bandwagon movement and start destroying property up here. It's not a very good look. Well, Andrew, we'd like to end the show on a positive note, and this was a really uplifting story that we came across this week. A veteran, a 99-year-old veteran, walked 100 kilometers to raise money for COVID research. So this guy was a World War II veteran from Newmarket, Ontario. He hit a new milestone. He walked 100 kilometers. That's a heck of a long way, 100 kilometers. So George Markar, who lives in the Roxborough Retirement Residence, have been walking a path in the garden at his home since April to raise funds. He's raised around $43,000 to date. He's vowing to keep going, and he has a GoFundMe campaign. So he finished his fundraiser and reached that 100-kilometer mark on Wednesday. So if you're so inclined and able, definitely support George in that effort. It's really inspiring when people do that. I mean, and for a 99-year-old to be able to walk and stay that active is really amazing and inspiring. So
yeah. Reminds me of Tom Moore, or now Sir Tom Moore, who we talked about in the UK a few months ago, who did something very similar. And remember, you can just be even in a retirement home, but if you have the ability and the energy and the will to do this, heck, I don't even know if I could do 100K as easy as this 99-year-old did. So maybe I have to get to it after the show.
Yeah, you gotta catch up, Andrew. But yeah, really inspiring, and it's great to see Canadians doing their best to try to make a difference and doing it even in your own individual way. Well, that's it for us here. It's Labor Day, so hopefully everyone has a wonderful final weekend of summer. And thanks so much for tuning in. We will be back again next week.